Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today on this lovely summer's day. My name is Megan Bellister. I am the Nell J. Redfield Curator of Learning and Engagement here at the Nevada Museum of Art. I hope all of you have been able to go upstairs and see the Sea Dragons of Nevada exhibition. In 2024, the museum commissioned Elaine Parks to create a sculpture for the show, and it's right when you walk in the door. There's these 5 beautiful sculptures just waiting for you to come look at them. If you haven't had the opportunity, please do so at the end of the talk. We are joined today by Elaine Parks. Elaine is a ceramicist and sculptor. She has an MFA from California State University, Los Angeles. She currently divides her time between Reno and Tuscarora. She has worked with adults and children in a variety of settings throughout her career and uses many media in her own art. Oh, and then I said it already. Please join me in welcoming Elaine Parks.
Hello, I'm Elaine Parks. First, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to the Nevada Museum of Art for inviting me here today to share my work with you. I've shaped this presentation as a kind of retrospective that covers the last 25 years from when I first moved here at the end of 1999. And my intention is to provide a sense of the evolution of my work over time and how living in the high desert has affected my work. This slide represents a pivotal moment in my life. On the left is Los Angeles, the city I grew up in, and on the right is Tuscarora. During grad school at Cal State University, Los Angeles, the chair of my art department, Joe Soldate, suggested that I visit Tuscarora. Joe had lived there for a time and was a colleague of Dennis Parks. And for those of you who don't know, Dennis founded the Tuscarora Pottery School in 1966, and that helped make Tuscarora kind of an artist colony. Joe thought I would like Tuscarora, which I did so much that I moved there after grad school. It was a big contrast. I like to say I moved from a town of 14 million to a town of 14. Nevada has a fairly small arts community where people know one another, so even though Tuscarora is extremely remote, I was able to connect with a larger arts community across Nevada. I was very impressed by what I saw going on in the institutions, the art institutions, such as this museum, Oates Park Art Center in Fallon. There was Neon Magazine at that time, which was published by Kirk Robertson, and there were several DIY galleries around Reno at that time. And I was able to seek out opportunities to participate in some of this regional art scene in my early years in the state. And this fact affirmed that my choice to move to the middle of nowhere was justified. These pieces are from a group of work I created for the Governor's Arts Awards. I was selected twice to create these awards, first in 2001 and again in 2006. And these are from the second time. Also around the same time, I was very honored to receive 2 Nevada Arts Council Fellowship grants in 2003 and 2009. All of these awards were meaningful acknowledgments during my early years in the state. This series was inspired by the changing seasons. Having grown up in Los Angeles, I had not experienced living in 4 distinct seasons, and it had made a big impression on me. So here I was layering the seasonal colors of the landscape over a textured grid. And this grid was a recurring element in my work at the time. And it was inspired by some repeating elements in the natural landscape, in particular anthills. I was fascinated to discover that the area surrounding anthills is often devoid of vegetation, creating distinct clearings that appear across the ground with some random regularity. At the same time, the grid also alludes to the way humans attempt to impose structure on the natural world. In a related thought about imposing structure, I did like how when making this work, that even though the grid is not measured out or even strictly regular, that the eye reads it as a regular pattern. And this could be attributed to something called perceptual organization. This is a psychology term meaning grouping visual elements together. Also around this time, I came across Edward O. Wilson's concept of biophilia, and that's an idea that resonated with me. In his book by the same name, Wilson describes this as the innate tendency to focus on life and lifelike processes. This is very true for me. I feel wired to respond to the living world around me, and this instinct plays a central role in how and why I make the work I do. My own engagement with lifelike processes always includes rocks. The image on the right shows stones that I collected in the creek beds around Tuscarora. I was struck by the blue inclusions in the gray rock and how they seem to echo the raised dot pattern I had been working with. It felt like a moment of recognition, as if nature affirmed the direction I was taking. The piece on the left, along with the following slides, is from a body of work shown at Oates Park Art Center in Fallon in 2009 in an exhibition titled Someplace, Somewhere. And this particular series with a field of blue dots is called Night Sky Reversed. Here's the rest of the Night Sky Reversed series. And at this point in my work, I began to explore the theme of opposites. These forms are shaped like puffed pillows. I'm attempting to evoke both softness and solidity in the same pieces. And this idea came in part from my experience in our landscape, where from a distance, mountains can appear soft and velvety with pastel colors. But those of us who hike these mountains know that's usually not the case. And I wanted these pieces to reflect that contradiction, something holding the illusion of softness while being entirely hard. And here I'm also beginning to work with imagery drawn from both geology and astronomy, the rock formations and the brilliant night sky. But in this case, I'm using a reverse color palette to blur the distinction between earth and sky. This is a wall-size piece that was shaped by my experience of living in Tuscarora. There are many dirt roads that branch off in all directions around town, and I would walk these roads, and over time, I began to see them not just as a way to get from one point to another, but as a human-made pattern that was imposed upon the landscape. I was also spending many nights outside looking at the night sky, trying to pick out constellations. And I kept thinking about how constellations work. We're drawing lines between the stars to form something recognizable. And this feels not so different from laying out roads in the desert, so this piece brings together those two ideas, and it's about the human need to find orientation. And here's just an example of some of the roads that are around Tuscarora. This photo is taken from a high vantage point, and I've highlighted the roads for you so you can see them as a kind of a diagram on the land. In 2009, this museum invited me to create a response to the Mormon cricket invasions that were happening around Tuscarora at that time. When the crickets arrive in town, sometimes they do so in massive numbers, and they're crawling all over everything. And while they don't cause damage in the usual sense, their overwhelming presence transforms the town, making a place that seems open and calm feel occupied and under siege. Living in a rural place means having these kind of encounters with creatures and insects kind of on a regular basis. But when the crickets came to town, our response was very visceral. We wanted to do something. And some of our choices of things to do were practical, and some were kind of absurd. In the latter category, we took a cue from early Tuscaroraans who would bang a gong to scare away the crickets. So our modern version of that was to put radios outside and blast loud rock music 24/7. It didn't work. But it did eventually become the correct answer to a trivia question on the radio show, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. My goal in creating this installation was to mimic the cricket's physical behavior and presence as accurately as I could, but with the exception of color. And the cricket on the right seemed to agree with me. He got into a black bag of plaster and came out white, like the ones I made. Here's the installation, titled Swarm. It consisted of about 2,000 hand-formed crickets mounted to the walls and covering the floor. Each one is made from unfired clay with wire legs. I chose not to fire them because, like real crickets, they're meant to be impermanent. When cricket season ends and they die, their bodies dry up and blow away. So it felt appropriate to let the materials echo that same temporary life cycle. The installation was meant to create a sense of visual overwhelm, evoking a feeling of infestation, but without the movement or noise or smell, but with the same uneasy saturation. I wanted the viewer to feel the tension of standing just outside of something encroaching. Around this time, I had to return to Los Angeles to help care for my elderly parents. One of the responsibilities I had was to clear out a 4,500 square foot warehouse space that had belonged to my father. It was packed with decades of accumulated materials, and my goal was to eventually rent the space to support their care. After months of clearing it out, I gave myself an incentive to finish, and I invited a group of about 25 artists, along with musicians and performers, to use the space as a 2-month-long exhibition and series of weekend performances. This show was called Playland. Most of the participating artists were from Los Angeles, but a few friends from Reno, whom I'd met during the Nada Dada motel shows, traveled down to join us. Many of the artists used objects salvaged from the warehouse to make their work, and others treated the space as an experimental venue. The next several slides are some of what happened during that show, and I'll point out some of the pieces. In the upper left, the tall sculptures are by Kenzie Shiokawa. He's since passed away, but he had been represented by Strummel Gallery here in town. The string of oranges in the lower left is by Matt Wardell, and these oranges were left to rot and drip during the full run of the exhibition. The grid of photos on the top center is by Reno photographer Stephanie Hogan, who's in the audience. The black and silver ink blot piece to the right of Stephanie's is mine, made from using tar paper and silver aluminum paint that I found in the warehouse. And above my piece, you'll see heads that are portraits of well-used toys by Tiger Munson, who's also in the audience. The animation still on the bottom right is by Jason Lockyer, who used this space to create a version in development for a large sculptural animation about insects. The top center photo, the image that shows photos of moths in flight, are by Dean Burton, who's a photo professor at TMCC. Below that is work by Neil Taylor, who created his figures and clothing forms from old canceled checks and time cards found in the warehouse. The images on the left are by Stanton Hunter. While we were setting up our exhibition, there were some people living outside on the street, and Stan responded to that by creating cardboard rooms, and he invited viewers inside, in the case of this one on the lower left, to lay down inside and look up into a chapel-like interior with colored light and architectural detail. The image on the lower right is by Chris Wagner, who made cast plaster forms and arranged them in a pattern that responded to the room. As part of Playland, we hosted a massive mail art show, as a show within a show with thousands of pieces of mail sent in from all over. Some of the friends helping organize this exhibit were longtime male artists, and they tapped into their global network for contributions. This slide shows some of the performances that took place during Playland. We had an opera singer, a sign language dance performance, electronic music made from rewired toys, and a walkabout by the LA Mud People. For me, organizing this event was a way to transform the space and the experience of clearing out decades worth of stored belongings and turning it into something more fun and creative. In 2011, I created an installation called Windfisher with my artist friend Ellie Geiser, who's from Switzerland. Ellie and I have done many projects together over the years, and for this one, we drove out onto the Bonneville Salt Flats to install a 45-foot-long fence, a cloth fence with sewn-in pockets. Our idea was simple. We wanted to catch whatever the wind might bring. We imagined this functioning like a screen that collected objects and debris blown across the salt flats. So this was an experiment in collaboration with each other and also with the landscape. But in the end, we only caught one thing, a single praying mantis. It was a nice thing. One of the most surprising aspects of this project was how the extreme flatness of the salt flats distorted our sense of scale, and how from a distance our 45-foot-long fence looked tiny. And this scale distortion affected our entire experience doing this project. When we were searching for a site to install it, we were driving out into that mountain in the center of this photograph, and we went much further than we thought we had because distance is so hard to judge. And we got stuck in the mud underneath the salt flats. The people in the upper right, on the upper left, on the ATVs came to our rescue. We were also there some days before the Bonneville speed trials, and the rest of these images are some of the interesting cars, people who are arriving to set up for their event. We also installed our Windfisher piece on a mine tailing in Tuscarora just to see it in a different environment. And while we were still out in the salt flats, we went hiking around the Silver Island Mountains to the west and discovered thousands of tiny bones at the base of a cliff where birds of prey lived. So the image on the right is some of our collection. And these little bones played a big role in a years-long exploration of constellations as drawings. I used the tiny bones as lines and pearls as stars and embedded these into roofing tar, which is a very, very dark black and has a malleable surface. And these materials allowed me to create what I thought of as fossilized light. And it continues the theme I had of holding opposites in the single piece where the materials are speaking of the earth and the image, it makes reference to the sky. And I want to mention again how constellations are a perfect example of how we make sense of complex systems by imposing patterns on the natural world in a way to orient ourselves in the landscape. And I continued to explore this idea using other materials. In the left, I've burned constellation imagery onto a hide, and on the right, I created clay bones with incised lines and seeds representing the stars. Also at this time, I found out about an ancient Chinese star chart that's dated from about 600 to 900. It was found in a cave on the Silk Road. So this star chart is, of course, the same stars, but with different drawings. And in these two pieces, I incorporated both the Chinese star chart and our Western star chart in the same pieces. Much of my work is made to resemble artifacts. This instinct comes in part from walking around Tuscarora, which is a former mining town, and the ground regularly heaves up little bits from the past. And I'm trying to recreate that experience in my work. There's a sense of wonder at finding something unfamiliar that has its own history. And for a long time, I didn't sign my work because I wanted it to feel really like an artifact. And I feel like when we find objects from the past, their power lies in that mystery, and they invite curiosity and interpretation. And so by not signing my name, I was letting my work exist outside of me, that something might seem older or timeless or simply its own thing. In 2022, I had my second show at Oates Park Arts Center. It originally had been scheduled for 2021, but was postponed due to COVID. I had been invited to do this show by Valerie Serpa, but by the time it was rescheduled, she had tragically passed away. This was a terrible event for many, many of us. The show was titled "The End is Near." That's an ominous phrase that has always circulated in the background of culture, but during the pandemic, it felt newly urgent and literal. And I was back living in Tuscarora during the pandemic, and while life was more or less normal in Tuscarora, because we're isolated anyway, there was something I noticed that I hadn't seen before or after. There were many dead birds lying on the ground with no clear cause. And this felt like some real-life evidence for things falling apart. So this show grew out of that time and that feeling, and the following slides are work that was in that show. Some of the birds in the series were created using clay sticks, giving them an open and skeletal structure. And these are meant to be kind of a memory or a trace of a bird, suggesting a presence that is no longer whole, perhaps in decay. To make these sticks, I created a latex mold from pieces of weathered wood, and I used that texture to imprint on clay coils that I assembled into the bird forms. So the resulting pieces feel reconstructed and fragile, and it seemed appropriate for the subject matter of birds vanishing. And this piece pushes that idea into further abstraction. This falling owl is reduced to a kind of open framework that feels skeletal and provisional. It looks very fragile and suggests motion, like it's caught mid-collapse. These are two of the night sky pieces included in The End is Near. The form on the left is referencing skulls, often found in the desert. Skulls are kind of a symbol of the desert. And here I'm mapping on my imagined night sky onto this familiar shape, making an object of contemplation. On the right, this piece is titled Portal. It's shaped from constructed wood, covered in a field of pearl stars. And this split form recalls a coffin or a doorway or an opening in the sky. And these pieces, like so much of my work, are about the earth and sky, something grounded and something celestial. And this slide shows some installation views from the show. I made quite a few owls. Some were fleshed out, and some, like the one on the left, are created from the clay sticks. This one has an ashen surface, making it look burned. In the center, a cosmic moon anchors owls in flight on either side. And on the right, there's a little owl caught mid-descent. In 2023, I exhibited at Northwest Reno Library in a show called Fossils and Bones. This work brought together a range of sculptural forms that suggest artifacts and fossils. This series of sculpture originates from the idea of a desert walk, where things like rocks and bones come home with you. I considered these pieces as imaginary artifacts found on an imaginary desert walk. The tall standing pieces in the center I call bone stacks, and this marked a shift toward creating taller work that was composed of assembled parts. So I built these works combining these smaller components and using actual found objects as bases and invented bone-like shapes that were inspired by my observation of real bones. So this process became kind of a feedback loop between what I found in nature, what I imagined, and what emerged through the making. For the smaller work in this show, I became interested in exploring complex spaces through a process of construction that both encloses and reveals the interior forms. These pieces are meant to raise questions of classification and identity. Each one echoes multiple references, allowing for more than one interpretation to exist. Even the sense of scale is deliberately unclear, prompting the viewer to wonder whether the reference is microscopic or vast. And my aim in this duality is to invite curiosity and deeper engagement in looking. In 2024, I was invited back to Northwest Reno Library for a show called Growth. In this series, I explored plant and mineral growth with what has become my usual approach to multiple classification. Before I made this work, I had spent some time around Pyramid Lake and was noticing some of the tiny tufa rocks that had washed ashore and how each one had a completely different texture than the other. So these forms are influenced, their construction and textured surfaces are influenced by these tufa rocks I found there. This next group aligns more closely with plant or fungal growth. I started to incorporate a high-temperature wire into my process, and this allowed me to attach small cup-like elements that project from the surfaces. These attachments opened up a new dimension and complexity, letting the pieces feel more densely populated, almost like colonies or sprouting structures. And the repeated attachments suggest an accumulation over time. I felt like this process introduced a vitality to the static form, something that felt alive in its gesture, even though the material is inert. And also in 2024, I was asked by this museum to contribute to Deep Time, Sea Dragons of Nevada, which is on view until January 11th. I called this group of sculptures Fossilia. It's a name I made up, and it means like a fossil to me. These pieces were constructed in a similar way to the bone stacks by assembling smaller components to create a larger work. The thematic background is again coming from the desert. That's a place for me that I feel like leaves so much room for the imagination. And when I take desert walks, in particular in Tuscarora, I can and do imagine the landscape underwater, how it once was during the Pleistocene under Lake Lahontan. We do use language that refers to the vastness of the desert that can be attributed to the water, such as the sagebrush sea. There is something about the vastness of the desert that parallels the ocean. We have some mine tailings in Tuscarora that remind many of us of whales. There's one that's historically named Moby Dick. And so while it may seem that the desert and ocean are opposite environments, there's an echo of one within the other. While I was making these forms for sea dragons, I was musing on life that had grown and lived underwater, but had surfaced years later and to be discovered in a desert environment. And while my forms are entirely invented, the concept is rooted in how ichthyosaur fossils were eventually found. They're marine animals found 250 million years later in the Nevada mountains. And as you know by now, much of my inspiration comes from rock formations and their surfaces. To me, they have a presence that feels alive. And my aim is not to recreate the landscape, but to interpret it using repeated forms, structured irregularity that reflect nature's organized chaos. And through this approach, while I'm working, my own thoughts and associations with the land are animated. And while I want the work to resist clear identification, I also want it to feel like something familiar, like something you may be able to see in the outdoors. And my hope is that the landscape stirs to life in the viewer's imagination as well. Currently, I'm part of a 2-person show titled Fables and Myths, sponsored by the Carson City Arts Initiative, alongside Sue Cotter. This exhibition is on view at Bristlecone Gallery at Western Nevada College through September 10th. This body of work continues ideas I began developing in growth and Fossilia, especially the use of the small protrusions, resembling spores, and the surfaces that echo the porous textures of tufa. I would like to encourage you to visit the CCAI website. There's a wonderful essay by Chris Lanier that beautifully captures the feeling of this show. There's also an interview by Stefan Reed Stefan interviews Sue and myself about our work, and this is part of CCAI's Nevada Neighbors series. The images on the left in the slide explore a mutable scale of perception. Once again, I'm challenging the viewer to question whether they are looking at something that refers to something minuscule or vast. These forms evoke a duality that can suggest microscopic organisms such as spores or bacteria, or something immense like celestial bodies or alien landscapes. By occupying this ambiguous zone, the sculptures encourage a shifting sense of scale, creating a feeling at once intimate and expansive. The piece on the lower right is informed by the visual language of fungi, with clustered forms and spore-like protrusions that appear both alien and familiar. I'm drawn to, So I feel like this alien and familiar creates a tension between attraction and revulsion. I'm drawn to the otherness of nature, and this work feels like a successful expression of that uncanny quality. Several of the pieces in this slide were conceived of as grouped sculptural forms, and when placed together, they form an active relationship, what I started to think of as a relational symbiosis, where each form is responding to the others through closeness and shared features and a common visual language. I felt like simply the proximity and repetition started to bring some meaning into focus, where repetition suggests purpose and small differences suggest adaptation or evolution, operating as examples of symbiosis where each form influences and is influenced by the others next to it. And this is my method of working. When I create a piece, I always am informed by what the next piece will be from the piece I'm working on. But in this case, I chose to group them together. And this form reflects something that we see in nature, that when things live side by side, that they inevitably shape each other. And I'll end here with this slide, which is a sneak peek of some work for an upcoming show, a Brewery Arts Center satellite gallery that opens October 2nd with a reception November 7th. Thank you.
We are recording today's talk, so Caleb and I are going to come through the audience with microphones. If you have any questions for Elaine, we're going to pass you the mic so we can record your question. So does anybody have any questions for Elaine today?
Hi.
Hi, Daniela.
I was wondering, would you like to make jewelry with me? With your organic shapes.
Maybe.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. I don't know if she was. Hi.
Hi.
I have a question about the process. When you're making your art, do you conceive of the end product? Do you make sketches? Do you draw things out? That's one question. Another question is, as you're making it, where does it take you? Is it more open-ended, I guess?
So I'll have a thought based on process. Like, I often will limit my idea of what I'm going to do. Like, so I'll make these clustered forms, a group of clustered forms. And I will sometimes sketch it out pretty quickly, but I'm pretty open to things changing along the way. I actually like that part. I don't like too firm of an idea when I'm starting because, frankly, it's just fun to be working with clay, and I want to see what it does and experiment. So it often changes. And then I'll get ideas while making one piece that will flow into the next piece.
Hi. I had a question kind of pertaining to the last comment that you made about what you're working on the last piece flowing into the next piece. And you mentioned that in your process, you're always thinking about the next piece that will come out of the one you're presently working on. I was wondering if you could say more about that, kind of what's happening in your mind while you're doing that. Are you recuperating ideas you intended to implement in the piece you're working on and the next one that maybe you didn't feel like you fully fleshed out in the present piece, or what's going on with that?
Yeah, I think, I feel like I'm always trying to get better. So if I feel like something isn't coming together, it's living before me. So if it's not quite working, then I'll take those ideas to the next piece. And I feel like there's always a forward progression. It should get better, technically and also just visually. It's such a tactile material that, I have a fair amount of control over it, but not 100%. Clay has its own mind of it. So I feel like I'm always learning. I don't know if that answered your question. Okay.
Do you teach at Tuscarora?
I have.
Are you going to this summer?
I'm not going to this summer, no.
Sorry. Are your clays from a certain place on Earth that you've chosen, or are your clays commercial, or are they created by you?
They're commercial. It's a nice romantic idea to dig up clay from the ground and make it into something workable, but boy, that's a lot of work. And I'd rather spend the time making things. And the clays around Tuscarora, there's clay everywhere. And a lot of those mine tailings are clay, and I have messed around with them. But they're often what we would call short. They don't respond in a nice way, the way commercial clays do.
So I wanted to confirm, the last slide is what's on display down in Carson?
The last, actually, 3 slides, there's a show up currently at Bristlecone Gallery, and there's a show coming up in Carson in October at Brewery Arts Center Satellite Gallery. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I really appreciated the pieces that you put together and how the shapes influence. I'm going into my 6th decade, and I feel like I'm constantly now reflecting on all the different things that shaped me, and that was a really incredible visual to take away, so thank you for sharing that and creating it.
Thank you.
Hi, Elaine. Can you talk a little bit about not just your process, but your limitations? Because I know that you do have a smaller kiln, and that does create the reasons why you do some of the pieces that you've been creating is because you don't have a larger magnitude to work from.
That is true, but also there's the limitation, just my physical limitations, like the pieces upstairs. I honestly couldn't work too much larger than those individual components because you have to lift these things up and get them in a kiln, and it's nice to have some independence in the studio because you can't always just call up a friend to help you. They're busy and you're on a schedule. Working in components sort of has opened up a new realm in my thinking. Yeah. Clay is heavy. It's very physical. The boxes of clay are 50 pounds. There'll come a point where I won't be able to do it.
Okay, I'd like to thank Elaine so much for coming and all of you for coming today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I don't know if I'm still live. Thanks. I don't know. I'm not sure. He has a... Oh, I am mic'd. Okay, I won't say anything. Here, maybe I could do this.